The Amanda Project by Melissa Kantor and Amanda Valentino. Chapter 13. "I'm telling you that girl was an F-R-E-A-K freak," said Tracy, dipping a carrot in Kelly's container of ranch dressing. "She was in my history class, and she was always going like, 'How do you know for sure? How do we know for sure?' It was so annoying. I thought Mrs. Ballalucci was going to smack her." "God, can you imagine the article she would have written? 'Schools returned to capital punishment.'" Kelly framed an imaginary headline in the air with her hands. "It's corporal punishment," corrected Heidi, rolling her baby blue eyes. "Capital punishment is the death penalty." Kelly shrugged. "What F?" she said. Then she turned to me. "Okay, so to help you get over the suffering you endured yesterday, I am personally going to do your makeup for Liz's party Saturday night. We are going to look fabulous." I smiled, but having spent the entire night lying in my bed and waiting for Amanda to call, I was way too tired to speak. I texted Amanda twice already since getting the money, but she hadn't gotten back to me. Now my phone was in my pocket on vibrate, but I wasn't exactly expecting it to ring. "Are you okay?" asked Tracy. She put her hand on my shoulder and stroked my arm. "Did those freaks hurt poor Callie?" "Yeah, you're acting really weird," said Heidi, irritated. "No, I'm fine," I said, not wanting to piss off Heidi. Was this what Mr. Randolph had been talking about yesterday when he lectured us on entangling alliances? I made myself sit up straighter. "Really, I'm just so tired." "Hey, Jake. Hey, Lee." Heidi was looking over my shoulder, and her voice was sing-songy the way it always gets when the guys are around. "Hey, Keith." A second later, Jake, Lee, and Keith appeared at the end of our table. Seeing Keith made me think of the fight with Mia yesterday, and I couldn't look at him. Lee had on this Abercrombie jacket he wears a lot that looks really good on him, and his cheeks were flushed like maybe they were all coming in from the fresh air. Sometimes I'm worried that with his designer clothes and perfect body, he's totally out of my league, and it's only a matter of time before he realizes it. "Ladies," said Jake, glancing around and smiling at us. Jake, Keith, and Lee have been friends forever, but while Keith and Lee have always been cute, Jake used to be kind of pudgy and short. I always thought of him more as Keith and Lee's sidekick than anything else. He'd gotten much taller lately, not as tall as Lee, but definitely not a shrimp, and he'd thinned down and gotten contact lenses. Suddenly he was Mr. Tall, Dark, and Handsome, and the rumor about his family being some kind of royalty back in India where his parents were born didn't seem terribly far-fetched. Sometimes Heidi joked about helping Jake's family reclaim their throne, and even though he'd explained about 1,000,000 times that there was no throne, Heidi never completely dropped it. The truth was, if Heidi wanted there to be a throne, I had the feeling that somehow there was going to be a throne. "So, are you guys going to Liz's tomorrow?" asked Heidi. It was a rhetorical question. Liz wasn't as popular as the I-girls, but she was pretty cool, and she lived in this huge house about a block away from Heidi's. Every year for her birthday, she has this gigantic party, and everybody who's anybody in our grade goes. Even some of the older kids come because her brother's a year ahead of us, and he usually invites a bunch of his friends. "Are you going to talk to us if we go?" asked Jake. "Or are you just going to ignore us and talk to all the older guys?" He was leaning over Heidi, and she was looking up at him, and I couldn't believe he hadn't asked her out yet. "Well, maybe you should give us a reason to talk to you," Heidi answered, twirling a length of pale blonde hair. "Make it worth our while." "Is that a challenge?" Heidi bragged. Keith was leaning toward Heidi, too, his football jacket hiding his thick neck. I wondered why people always described the popular girl as a queen bee. It was more like she was a flower and all the other kids in the grade were bees, circling around and trying to get to her. While I was watching Heidi talk to Keith and Jake, Lee had come around to my side of the table. "How's it going?" he murmured. It was like he was asking about something a little bit secret. "Okay," I said. It was only one word, but it felt like the biggest lie in the universe. "I saw you yesterday, Callie." I still loved it when he said my name. "When you were washing that car." His brown eyes were almost gold in the sun streaming through the cafeteria windows, and again I was struck by how impossible it was that Lee Forrest could exist in the same universe as Amanda, Nia, and Hal, and that both universes were my universe. "Yeah," I said, "I saw you too." I remembered his waving for me and cheering and how good it made me feel. Thanks for the support. No problem, said Lee. What's the deal? Why did Thornhill make you clean his car? Do you know Amanda or something? That's the problem with lies. Once you start telling one, you can't stop. Not really. She's in my math class. Wow, said Lee. So she must be like some kind of math genius. Lee was always saying nice things like that. Well, she is, actually, I said. After listening to the iGirls trash her so much, I was glad to be able to say something honest and complimentary about Amanda out loud. And I said it again. She is a real genius. Amanda stopped being the topic of conversation as talk turned to the weekend and Liz's party, which was a relief. When the bell rang at the end of lunch, we all got up from the table together, and even though we hadn't been talking or anything, it just worked out that Keith and I walked out of the cafeteria together. When we got to the door of my bio class, Keith was in the middle of telling me something about his family's plans for spring break. I looked up and saw Hal and Nia. They were coming down the hall, and Nia saw me, but Hal didn't. She looked at me, looked at Keith, then looked away as if she'd just laid eyes on the most revolting sight possible. Isn't that wild? Finished Keith. What? I said. Then to stop him from repeating himself, I just said, I mean, yeah, totally. It's totally wild. Got a motor, said Keith. Later. Later. I walked into the biolab and dropped into my seat, where I spent the next 40 minutes staring blankly at the board, not understanding a word Dr. Moser uttered. I'd called my dad when Amanda didn't show for math class, and, as we agreed, he picked me up in his truck after school. It looked like he might have slept in his clothes, but as far as I could tell, he was sober. We're returning the money, he said grimly, and I could tell he was angry. Oh, I said. When I left him last night after telling him all about how I got the money, he said he wanted to sleep on it. And now that he'd made his decision, I couldn't help feeling a little bit proud of him. Sure, we might lose our house, but at least we weren't going to keep it by using possibly stolen goods. Now, where does Amanda live? I'd never actually been in Amanda's house, but once when we were biking to go get coffee after school up in College Green, part of Orion. It's called that because of all the streets are named after colleges and universities, not because there's an actual college there. Amanda had pointed to a really nice Victorian house. That's where I live. She was a little bit ahead of me, and she didn't slow down or anything. I was kind of surprised. Don't you want to go inside? I knew Amanda was living with her father's parents. Her mom was an anthropologist who was doing field work in Uganda for the academic year, and her dad was traveling a lot because of the work he did for the United Nations, something with micro-loans in Latin America. I'd never met anyone who actually lived with guardians and not parents before, but in Amanda's case, it totally made sense. There was something about Amanda that made it seem almost like she didn't have parents. It was like she was, I don't know, too removed from the average teenage stuff the rest of us have, like parents and curfews and fights about whether or not she'd done her homework or could go have money to go to a movie. There was something about the whole setup that made me even more curious to see her house, to meet her grandparents. Not especially. She'd gotten a little farther ahead when I slowed down to look at the house, and now she had to shout for me to hear her. Come on! Before I started pedaling faster, I got a good look at the front porch, where a really nice old-fashioned swing hung. The door, which was a bright sky blue, was slightly open, like it was inviting me to come inside. The house was old, but it was in pristine condition, and as I rode past, I realized it reminded me of my house before my mom left. It's kind of cool that Amanda's house was so much like mine, or like mine used to be. Maybe our families would turn out to have all kinds of stuff in common. Maybe when my mom came back from wherever she was, my dad started acting normal again, and Amanda's mom came back from Uganda, and her dad finished traipsing around south of the border, they'd meet and like one another, and the four of them would become friends. It was such a nice picture, the six of us at a barbecue at our place or stringing popcorn on a Christmas tree at Amanda's, that I kept it in my head for the entire ride. I thought I'd remembered what street was Amanda's, but when we turned onto it, I realized it couldn't possibly be the one because this street had a sidewalk, and the one she and I had been riding on that day didn't. My dad had to drive around for almost 20 minutes before we hit the right block, and then we almost missed the house because they'd repainted the door red. The whole time we were driving, my dad was getting more and more agitated, but I didn't know if it was because he was having second thoughts about giving back the money, or because he hadn't been this sober at this time of day in months. I called her from the car, again, and she didn't answer, again. In truth, I was a little nervous about seeing her face to face after everything that had happened since I last saw her. As much as I was dying to ask her what the hell was going on, part of me was almost hoping she wouldn't be home, that I'd just meet her grandparents, give them the envelope with the money in it, and leave a message for her to call me. My dad was a few feet ahead of me, and when we got to the door, he rang the bell, then knocked, as if he were too impatient to wait even a second for someone to answer. At first there was only silence from inside, but then we could hear footsteps, and a voice said, "I'm coming." A minute later the door swung open, and an elderly man in a wine-colored cardigan stood facing us. He had to have been at least 80, which was older than I had imagined her grandfather being. "Hello," said my dad, and I was relieved that he didn't sound too angry or impatient. "We're here to see Amanda." The man smiled up at my dad, and despite his age and stooped posture, I sensed something vibrant in him. "I'm sorry, I don't hear as well as I should. Could you say that again?" "We're here to see Amanda," said my dad, louder this time. "Amanda?" asked the man. He was still smiling like people showing up at his house and making demands was something he truly enjoyed. "Amanda," my dad looked over at me, and I supplied the word he wanted. "Valentino," I said. Though considering she lived here, I couldn't see why her grandfather, no matter how old, would need to be reminded of her last name. "I'm sorry," repeated the man. "Did you say Amanda Valentino?" "Yes," answered Dad. He shook his head. "I'm afraid there's nobody here by that name."